Night of September 30th to October 1st, 331. BCE on the wide plain near Gaugamela, Alexander's generals crowded into his tent with a hard offer. Strike now in darkness before the Persian king could use the level ground he had prepared. He listened, weighed it, and declined in one plain sentence of sense and steel. If we attack at night, we lose cohesion and control. The trigger was the push for a surprise assault. The underlying causes were Alexander's belief that disciplined formations and planned signals would beat a larger army only if his captains could see him and hear him. A phalanx is a tight block of infantry whose strength is alignment. Overlapping shields and long spears work only when files stay straight. At night, straight lines bend. Darius had chosen the field and scraped it flat for chariots, which meant darkness would not hide pits or rocks, but would hide flags, trumpets, and hand signs. Scythed chariots are 2 horse carts with blades on the hubs to tear open ranks. They need hard open ground to do their worst. That is why Darius's labor crews had spent days smoothing the plain by the gate of Gaugamela. Alexander knew the ground favored the Persians in daylight, but he also knew that darkness would favor confusion, and confusion would erase the one edge he owned. Sources disagree on exact numbers, but the ratio was clear enough. The Persians outnumbered the Macedonians by at least 2 to 1. When a smaller army lives by coordination, it treats visibility like food and water. His officers argued the other side. Night could cut the chariot threat, because the drivers would fear ditches. It could also sow panic in a camp that stretched for miles. They added that the moon would give a little light, and the men were eager after a long march. There were alternatives besides now or never. He could delay a day to rest and scout the far end of the plain, which might let him shift the fight toward rougher ground. Or he could pretend agreement, send raiders, and test the picket line without risking the whole army. But each path had costs. Delay risked letting Darius extend the level field and move more troops. Raiding risked a muddled skirmish that might burn morale without changing the map. Alexander kept his answer simple, because simple is what carries through an army. He told his marshals they would fight at dawn on ground they could see, with signals everyone recognized. The decision respected the constraints of both sides. The Macedonians had heavy infantry, whose spears were 16 to 20 feet long, cavalry that depended on coordinated wheeling, and a chain of commands built on sight and sound. They had no radios, no night vision, and only torches that ruin one's view of the dark fields beyond the flame. They also had men who had marched for years and fought in Asia Minor and Syria, which meant their discipline, more than their numbers, was their power. The Persians had breadth. They could spread out, curve around a flank, and use the plain to stretch the line until a thin spot opened. They could throw chariots to stampede gaps and follow with cavalry floods if the enemy wavered. They also had coordination problems under torchlight, because managing wide wings at night turns orders into rumors. Because the larger army had prepared the ground, it might seem the night attack was the cleverer choice. Yet the very fact of preparation created a trap. If the Macedonians stumbled in the dark, the fault would be theirs. If they held their shape by day, the field could be turned from Persian asset to Persian liability. Alexander spent the last hours of the night doing work no night assault would have allowed. He walked the lines so officers could read his face and hear his plan. He explained the opening. Refuse the left to avoid being outflanked, slide the right diagonally toward the Persian left to draw it outward, and search for the seam where a shock charge could break the center. Refuse, in this sense, means to hold back one wing, keeping it angled away to deny the enemy easy overlap. He placed lighter troops ahead to blunt the chariots. He instructed gaps to open and swallow the carts if they came straight, then close behind them. He set a reserve, small, precious, and ready to plug holes, because reserves are the only insurance a smaller army owns. The night passed in a quiet he had chosen. Men slept in turns rather than stumbling through ditches by torch. Horses were fed and watered. The line knew where to go at first light, because the ground had been paced in the evening, not felt by guess in the dark. Just before dawn, scouts returned with news that confirmed the wisdom of daylight. The Persian line ran long, banners spaced like a forest edge, with chariots massed forward and cavalry stacked on the wings. The Macedonians could see it, measure it, and mark their intervals. Because the sun would rise at their backs, the glare would trouble Persian eyes more than theirs. The weather itself had no drama. Dry air, open sky, which meant the decisive element would be human order. Next came the immediate test of his reasoning. The Persian chariots rolled. Light troops hurled javelins and arrows, drummers beat time, and as carts reached the Macedonian front, rehearsed paths opened and closed. Where carts broke through, secondary lines met them. Where they faltered, horses shied away from sharp spikes and flying missiles. Therefore the fearsome first punch became clutter on the field rather than a hole in the line. As this happened, Alexander nudged his right forward on the slant. The move pulled part of the Persian left outward to guard the flank, which meant the great line stretched thinner near the center. This was the daylight logic he had promised. Create a gap by drawing an enemy wing, then drive through the opening with speed where distance, not darkness, breaks their control. Behind the advance rode the companion cavalry, his best shock arm, bridled to his signals and ready to pivot when the seam opened. Meanwhile, he kept his refused left anchored under able generals who knew the assignment. Endure, bend, but do not break, and avoid the enveloping arm that the larger army would try to throw. Some ancient writers still argue about details, exact distances, which wing yielded first, who crossed which gap at what minute, but they agree on the sequence that mattered to his choice. The choice to avoid a night assault kept his army cohesive enough to execute a refined plan under full view. It also denied the enemy the kind of chaos that numbers love. By late morning, the gap he sought appeared. What followed lies just beyond our narrow window. A hard charge at the center, a royal chariot wheeling and a line that lost its nerve. The immediate outcome was victory on that open plain, a victory that sent the Persian king away from the field and placed the road to Babylon and Persepolis within reach. The long-tail consequence was larger than one day's glory. Daylight at Gaugamela confirmed that disciplined formations, aggressive maneuver, and clear signals could beat mass on prepared ground, which fed the tradition that shaped Hellenistic warfare, and through it, the military thought of later ages. Alexander's refusal to attack at night was not caution dressed as wisdom. It was a tactical principle stated in simple words and proven by the next morning's moves. Clarity can outperform chaos when discipline is your edge. If this turning point sharpened your sense of how choices shape outcomes, like and subscribe for more from Vanguard Lore.